Hello, my name is Niall Keegan. I'm a lecturer at the Irish World Academy of Music and Dance here at the University of Limerick, or in these COVID days, maybe not so much here at the university, but at home in my very messy office. At the university, I'm the course director of our BA in Irish Music. I'm also the course director of our MA in Irish Traditional Music Performance. Some people regard that as being a peculiar thing or peculiar positions. I mean, why do we need to study traditional music in a university or in any educational setting? It's a music that has always existed and survived and indeed flourished outside of institutional and in particular educational institutions. The history of traditional music in third level and in schools and in other such institutional contexts is long. I'm not going to get into it here, but I am reminded of my former mentor and boss, the Professor Micheál Sullivan, who was giving a presentation at the Willie Clancy Week. At the end of his presentation, one particularly irate accordion player, who I will not name, I won't tell you their name, stuck his hand up for a question and said, "Will I need a degree from the University of Limerick to get into the session in the back room of the Central Hotel at the Willie Clancy Week?" And that probably is indicative of some of the suspicion that the community has had over the last 20, 30 years about traditional music in the university. There, of course, are inherent dangers in the institutionalization of something like Irish traditional music in a third level context. A perusal of social media platforms will show you that many people blame third level institutions for contemporary, off the wall band arrangements, bland commercialism, as is seen in phenomena like Fla TV, and even bad tune writing. Some serious critique has come from others, such as Fintan Ballady, who was concerned about the classicalisation of traditional music in the university and the conservatoire, and the development of school sounds and styles which could be seen as the antithesis of more traditionally generated sounds and styles. These are concerns that we're very aware of, and they're very real. They can be seen as a conflict of value and especially a conflict of language. For example, the Arts Council in Ireland has traditionally had a really difficult time in engaging communities of traditional arts as the language of art with a capital A, and creative practice used by institutions like the Arts Council come from, to a large extent, centuries of elite, literate, artistic, global and privileged practice. Traditional music, as an example, comes from centuries of peasant, oral, far from privileged practices, and the practices from small places. I doubt that the great West Clare fiddle player Bobby Casey, when recording his album Casey in the Cowhouse, saw it as a work of art or himself as an artist. The words of value or traditional music practices come from the land and the working of it, the expression of a community that frames his art in the words and tools that it has available. I would argue that it is still fundamentally artful and creative, and that we can perceive this music in a way that can highlight its artistry and stay true to its roots and inherent values, in the way that perhaps you can say the Arts Council itself has done with projects like DESH and the traditional funding that they put into place. If we do engage in a process critically in a distilled environment, in an educational institution, we can facilitate a type of engagement with tradition that espouses its values and aesthetic. Our primary aim at the University of Limerick is not to make new tradition. It is to facilitate students being the best traditional musicians they can be through knowledge and critical engagement with processes around the generation of the best traditional music that can be found, which means we spend a lot of time, and dare I say it, money, bringing musicians into the University of Limerick to share with us their music and their art. There are a number of perspectives and approaches on how we can account for artistry in this particular context. I'm very much taken with a structure given to us by the great dance ethnographer and ballet dancer Anya Peterson-Royce from her book Anthropology of the Performing Arts, Artistry, Virtuosity and Interpretation. This book tries to engage issues of mastery, virtuosity, style, aesthetics and interpretation in predominantly dance contexts, which is interesting coming from a music context where the traditional discussion is based primarily on the acquisition of technique. She also has a lovely definition of art from a performance arts viewpoint and is presented in opposition to the view that the basis of art is technical mastery. Anya writes, art is a transformation of the mundane, of the ordinary goal-oriented processes that characterize our workaday world. In its form, art is freed of purpose other than to exist in and of itself. It engages in elaborations of form and process. It plays with form, no matter the genre, and in so doing grants the exercise of the imagination to its creators. Now, much as I fundamentally disagree with the separation of art and external purpose, I think it's one of the conceits of Western art music, and that people don't make any art for any reason apart from the making of great art. Most great artists make great art in order to eat. But the emphasis here on elaborations on form and process is really fundamental for me. Form, for me, in the traditional music context, is the generic dance tune structures. What makes a reel rather than a hornpipe or a jig? This is fairly fixed, but it does occasionally move. You can hear it move in the music of Tommy Potts when he subverts the basic phrasing of a tune. We can hear it in the acquisition of more exotic rhythms from Eastern Europe that a lot of contemporary bands, or bands since the 1970s, have been fixated on, which I suppose has its greatest expression in the music of Riverdance. And also you can hear it in the extended pieces of contemporary bands, such as Moxie, which really do transform the whole notion of what a tune can be. But form for me here is more importantly related to canon, the repertoire of the tradition, and the canon of performance. The melodies in Irish music are very obviously elaborated and reshaped in performance. There is a really, really strong ethos of respecting the tune in the tradition, but also there's a strong ethos of making your own of a tune. Great musicians often have their own versions or their own, as they call it, settings of tunes. Elaborations are based on ideas of aesthetic, style, and achieved through a grounding of technique, but not necessarily what we would call virtuosity. Process involves a whole array of stylistic and technical options, or what I call elsewhere parameters, that I have accounted for in articles about style. Again, these are not rooted solely in technique, but in the style and aesthetic which can be formed out of limited levels of technique and virtuosity. What I'm trying to say here is that some of the greatest traditional music we can hear isn't necessarily technically virtuosic. It is necessarily formed by a musicality based in the context of the music itself and its history and its aesthetic. Certainly we have our virtuosos, our Frankie Gavins, our Michael Colemans, our Matt Malloys, our Martin O'Connors, but many of the great stylistic icons of tradition build monumental music out of fairly selective and limited stylistic palettes. Some of my favourite music is made by musicians like Leitrim flute player John McKenna, Clare's great Michael Russell, and Kerry's Johnny O'Leary, who define aspects of what it is to make great traditional music. You can say that those musicians, they define aspects of what a place sounds like. But you might not describe any of them as being particularly virtuosic. By the way, this isn't something that's peculiar to Irish music. Many musics are aesthetically structured like this, and perhaps it is the music of the West, and classical music in particular, that privileges virtuosity and emphasises virtuosity and complexity. So, back to the Bucks. We're going to look at just the first 8 bars of this tune. This is the most common of reels, and shows some of the ways traditional musicians can make art out of the simplest of melodies through the elaboration of form and melody, again in process, as well as other tools for artistry within the tradition. The tune itself appears in the late 19th and early 20th century in the repertoires of traditional Irish musicians. It's perhaps, like many other tunes like Lucy Campbell's or The Boyne Hunt, a descendant of the 18th century Scottish reel The Perthshire Hunt, composed in around 1788, and excuse my pronunciation, by Miss Sterling of Ardagh, Magdalene sterling, and had dates I think were 1765 to 1846. It also appears in the great Scottish fiddle player and collector and composer Niall Gow's second collection of tunes. It appears most notably for Irish musicians in Captain Francis O'Neill's The Dance Music of Ireland and his big collection O'Neill's Music of Ireland, published in 1903, and is a tune that has historically been particularly associated with pipers, but perhaps more contemporarily with accordion players into the late 20th century. It's a real session staple. I couldn't imagine many traditional musicians not being familiar with it. It's a tune that would traditionally finish up the night. It's a big tune. We are going to look at just how style and artistry can be made with just the first 8 bars of this 4 but usually 5-part standard reel. It's really important to note that there is nothing definitive and very little standard about the approaches I'm going to talk about. Traditional musicians all speak about their approach to tunes at least slightly differently. It's also important to say that each group of techniques never really exists on their own. They all live in a context of a plethora of aesthetic techniques and approaches that work as a gestalt. So here is the basic model of the tune. So I'll play it for you here now as well. Be aware I'm a traditional musician, so I'm not very good at following scores. In fact, I'm not going to try and follow it at all. But it'll get you the idea that the point isn't the score, the point isn't the tune, the point is the elaboration. So, it's a really simple, straightforward reel, even though it has 5 parts. I've often been confused between the first and the second part. I always thought the second part was just a repeat of the first part, but it's slightly different, and most people would consider it to be a different part. But the rest of it is all constructed out of D major arpeggiation and is very, very standard, and can be often mixed up an awful lot, and you can mix up the parts, and no one really seems to mind too much. The fundamental thing, the most important thing about any Irish traditional dance music is the rhythmical structure, is the rhythm, how rhythm is made. This then relates very much into what Anya called form. And this is the very basic level where elaboration starts in traditional Irish music. What makes good Irish traditional music is good rhythm. We very much listen with our feet. If you'd have seen the music or would have heard the music 100 years ago, you'd have seen dancing. But still, even in that context, there are lots and lots of different options about the type of rhythm you want to make, and this is something that will come up time and time again. Listen here to Martin Hayes and Dennis Cowell playing the first part of the tune. Here you can hear a very different rhythm to the one I made, which was my rhythm was very much, if you had to account for it, we'd say it was in 2/2, a split common time, so you have that 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4 rhythm, which is fairly fundamental all the way through that. It varies sometimes, but that's fundamental. But if you listen to Martin and Dennis playing it here, you'll hear very much a 4/4 time, 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and 1 and 2 and 3 and 4 and so you have, instead of those 2 groups of 4, you have 4 groups of 2, and that seems to be the basis of what they're doing. And it's really, really important to note here that this isn't just made by the fiddle, but it's emphasized by the guitar, and that perhaps is a big part of the success of Martin and Dennis, in that they are very much a duo rather than a tune player and a backer. that comes from Martin and Dennis's album That Lonesome Touch, which go and buy it. Don't just download it from whatever platform you're using. But you can hear there, Martin and Dennis are making a really, really strong 4/4, that 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, which is the basic of the rhythm that they're making there. And one thing they do throughout all of their music is they tend to vary their rhythm in wild ways sometimes. But and I think again, it's something that I think is the different styles they can make in rhythm and in sound is part of the success. But if I had to account for that, of course, Martin's doing it with his bow, with his bowing and his bowing technique. But what's fundamental there are issues of emphasis, basically how strongly you hit or you force the volume on the note, and then of duration, how long you make that note. So you can go 1, 2, and 3 and 4, and which is emphasis, or you can go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, and which is also duration too. And they're really, really important. A second aspect of style that we'll listen to now in the music of Joe Cooley is ideas around articulation. Articulation is the way you separate notes, how you make spaces between the notes. Articulation tends to make certain types of different types of rhythm again. It tends to square up the rhythm. It makes it very even. It means it doesn't swing quite as much. So instead of going 1 and 2 and 3 and 4, or 1 2 3 4 2 2 3 4, it'll go 1 and 2 and 3 and 4. Now listen to this. I'm going to play you this little excerpt from the great South Galway accordion player Joe Cooley, and I'll play it first. I'll play it at speed, at normal speed, and then I'm going to slow it down just to bring out that how he changes from sort of legato, sort of joined up passages into very staccato separated passages, and the effect that has on rhythm. I hope you could all hear that there, where Joe Cooley would play the first part of the phrase really legato, but the last bar or so he chops them up. He separates the notes, and he does that quite simply by hitting the buttons more quirkily, more individually, making space between his strikes. So you have this sort of effect. Now, of course, I'm exaggerating it there, but the idea, it changes the feel, it changes the rhythm, and it's really, really, really effective. The next process or parameter that I'd like to talk about is phrasing. Now, phrasing for me as a flute player is really important. If I don't phrase, I die. I have to breathe. So I have to stop occasionally to breathe. But this isn't just a flute thing, or it's not just a wind instrument thing. Many instrumentalists do this. If you listen to John Carty play the fiddle or the banjo, he will stop the melody in certain places to make very obvious the phrasing. And it's something that an awful lot of older traditional musicians would regard as being really, really important and really, really vital to their style. And they'd see it as more important maybe to the flashier processes and techniques, like the ornamentations that younger musicians would talk about and would be very much into. So phrasing would be seen as a very, very traditional process and a very traditional style. Now, again, I mentioned earlier on Professor Micheál O'Sullivan. He wrote about the natural phrasing of a tune. Nearly all of our tunes are very, very symmetrical. They tend to be, they're call and response. Dum ba ba da 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 ba dum ba ba da ba dum. And it's very, very symmetrical, and that's the way it works. And he would have represented that, and he called it the natural phrasing of the tune. Now, for a lot of musicians, they stick to that natural phrasing. Some will just play all the way through the phrasing. If you listen to some of the great Donegal fiddle players, they'll play all the way through and they won't stop. Now some of them will, but some don't, and they just maintain a constant motor rhythm. For many musicians, no matter where you're from, the way you break it away from that natural phrasing is really, really important. And it can great drama and great artistry in the tune. So I will show you now two versions of the Boyne Hunt. The natural phrasing, which for me would be intrinsically boring and unartful, and then I'll show you alternative breaks and ways of playing the tune that take different spaces and different gaps. So have a look at this. So here we can see the phrasing, or two different versions of the phrasing of the first part of the Bucks. And you'll see on the top line, that A line, you can see what's called a natural phrasing. By the way, these scores that I'm putting up here, they're just illustrations. If you can't read them, well, you have an entire tradition with you, because traditionally people didn't write out this music. It was learned by ear, it was passed on by ear. So I'm just trying to illustrate for those of us who are cursed with musical literacy. But you'll hear from, I'll play through them and you'll hear the natural phrasing of the tune. Hear those natural breaks? And now the second line shows how you can avoid those so-called natural breaks, and it adds something of urgency, something of drama to the tune. So I'll play this now. I made one little mistake there, and you can tell me that afterwards. But you can hear the difference that makes the energy of the tune. Also very important is where you do take the break. People tend to miss in the motor rhythm, in the groups of four of the reel, that 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4 1 2 3 4. People usually like to miss the 2. They go 1 3 4 1 3 4. Sometimes they'll miss the 4. They go 1 2 3 1 2 3. You can, strictly speaking, you can miss any of them. It's quite a big deal to miss the 1, but you can see there in my version there, in the first bar I miss a 2 and a 3. I miss a 2 later on, I miss a 2 and a 3 later on, and I miss a 4 later on. So it's important that they can swap around too. I have just really illustrated a couple of what I call the parameters of style, or these processes of style that go on in a traditional music performance, or can go on. I mean, all these things like phrasing or articulation or rhythm, they can be varied, but they don't have to be varied, and they don't have to be acted on by the performer. They're part of a palette that the musician can choose from. But there are lots more, and I haven't got time to get into them here, as much as I'd love to, but you'd all be bored to death. But there's things like ornamentation. There's a whole world of variation with it, whether there are different motivations and different ways of changing the tune, the melody in itself. There's aspects of intonation, there's tonal colour, there's the speed of the tune, there's the instrument that you choose, the use of dynamics, the choice of repertoire, and then there's a whole sheaf of instrumental specific techniques that, we'd be here for months if we wanted to measure them all or account for them all. And of course we wouldn't, because some creative musician has come along with a whole new category of processes or parameters which will wreck our heads. But I want to finish up by just having a look at this tune played by one particular musician. Now, as I'm a flute player, and I grew up in the 1970s and 80s, there's one particularly influential flute player who sort of dominated our music, my musical world, and every other flute player of my generation and generations since, and that was Matt Malloy, who you probably are familiar with the Chieftains and his work with the Bothy Band, and currently a lot of his work with John Carty, a fiddle player from London. Now, Matt is an absolute complete virtuoso. There's no two ways about it. But I will put up, and I'll show you. I'll put up a YouTube clip of him playing. You might see there's James Galway is looking on adoringly, and he's been accompanied brilliantly by Donald Lundy. This is one of my personally great favourite pieces of traditional music, and it's just Matt Malloy and Donal Lunny playing the Box of Moore, and then we'll have a quick chat about it. I'll throw up a transcription which might make sense to you or not, and I'll show you some of the processes that are making it the great performance that it is. The master at work. What can we say about that? There's so much going on in that. Just that 8 bars, we could spend hours talking about all he does. Style-wise, the obvious thing that goes at some rate is it's got a fair clip. There's a beats every 100. There's 130 beats in a minute. If you look at the transcription here, I mean, even you don't have to be musically literate to comprehend the ornamental complexity of what's going on. There's an awful lot of ornamentation going on here. The thing about a transcription like this is that it doesn't convey half of the information you need to know. There's tonal colour. I mean, Matt is actually playing an E-flat flute there, which would brighten up his tone. It makes it that bit harder, sharper, and it just makes it sound wonderful. Other things that are going on, if you see in the very first bar there, you see the notes that are marked as red. That's him playing a long roll, but it's a long roll across the beat. So the main beat is actually happening in the middle of the roll, which sort of gives a slight but very traditional sense of syncopation going on. You can see in the blue piece there, in that bar at the end of the first line, that's the second round, the second time he plays the A part. He creates this, he changes the melody and creates this sequence which really enforces a 4/4 feel. You can see what I mean by the little arrow going up. He slides from his F sharp up to his G. The F sharp, the third note in the bar, he hits really hard, so he breaks it. The E and the D in the second group, he finds that magical place where he's actually making the E and the E in the octave below and the D in the octave below. You can see in the next line, the part that's marked green, he puts this variation of rolls with then a low D followed into it, and that gives a great effect where he sort of hits the fourth note of each group to get a nice sort of very traditional syncopated feel, it makes great music. There's so much going on here. There's so much great music going on here, and it is very virtuosic. There's no two ways about it. This is a virtuoso work, and we're only getting into some of the beauty that's happening here, but this is the sort of thing that drives me as a musicologist. I like this engagement. I like this, and I think it's one way of looking and perceiving a music, the history of music that we have, which is which can be really, really effective and really can help people learn about theirs and other people's artistic practices. There we go. A very short and a very quick approach and engagement with the art and the creativity that goes into the playing of the Box of Orabor, a standard Common Garden session tune where you can find some really, really beautiful things. This is the joy of traditional music. You don't have to be brilliant to be creative. You don't have to be a virtuoso to actually say something. And much as I do like virtuosity, I like brilliance, I think that we can appreciate that the music comes from somewhere else. It comes from somewhere, a sense of community, a sense of aesthetic, a sense of engagement, which is based in what it is to be Irish, what it is to be rural, what it is to be to be a musician in a different environment to that of the rest of the world. I hope you've enjoyed this. If you have any questions, contact me. I will have a quick slide which will have a bibliography, and I'll cite the sources for some of the music you've heard. Again, please, if you want to buy the music, get onto the artists and buy the CDs. And whatever you do, please don't go to a streaming platform, because no one gets anything else of that apart from the streaming platform. But yes, if you have any questions, please email me, please contact me, and I hope you have a good day.